Mrs. Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to take another look at this lovely book, Mysteries of the World, Unexplained Wonders and Mysterious Phenomena. So I've already picked the chapter. I thought we could take a look at some of the stories in this chapter titled Miracles and Mysteries. Reports of religious wonders and mysteries have been passed down in great numbers. Most of these come to us through the monks who recorded them in ancient handwritten manuscripts, which were later transmitted to the congregation by priests and ministers. It is no longer possible to know for certain how many of the early traditions of the Church actually represent historical events. In many cases, the stories are better understood as allegories, tales designed to send a specific message. Since the Middle Ages, many new mysteries and miracles have entered the picture. These have been more precisely documented both by the religious and the secular side, which can be explained by the increasing separation between church and state. Secular and religious authorities, both trying to justify their right to power, welcomed seemingly inexplicable phenomena as evidence of their God-given status. During the Renaissance, when most sacred symbols and signs conveyed political meaning, a scientific interest in miracles and mysteries began that continues to this day, leading to an improved standard of investigation. This section of the book deals with religious miracles and wonders from different epochs, beginning with the period of the biblical Old Testament and just survived an unimaginable flood with the help of the ocean god Enki. By building an ark, he was able to survive, the only human to do so. Okay. Traces of the flood. Scientific circles agree that an Earth-circling flood could not possibly have taken place. Many see an inundation over a large area as equally unlikely. The length of time that it rained has been similarly brought into question, as has the landing place of the ark, named Mount Ararat in the Bible. The widespread opinion was and remains that this is a mountain in Armenia, disregarding the fact this mountain was called something different during biblical times. Comparison with the more accurate Babylonian texts revealed that a small plateau in the delta of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers is also named Ararat. For centuries, adventurers have been pulled in both directions. Excavation on Ararat supposedly uncovered parts of the ark, including a ship hull in the Ararat region. In 2003, a Russian group found evidence of stone anchors on the mountain. Needless to say, none of this has survived more exacting investigation. As already mentioned, since a worldwide flood is not possible, individual scholars operate on the presumption that the biblical flood was an inundation that covered the land far and wide for a lengthy period of time. Early in the 20th century, British archaeologist Charles Leonard Woolley, 1880 to 1960, found some evidence that Mesopotamia had suffered such a catastrophe, but it was not until the years 1993 and 2000 that evidence was revealed proving that natural disasters on this dramatic scale actually happened. After the Russian ship Aquanaut found remains of freshwater plants deep in the Black Sea in 1993, Robert D. Ballard, who located the wreck of the Titanic, investigated the sea bottom further. He came upon the remains of a human settlement dated to around 5600 BC, which had been the victim of a natural disaster. Whether this is also evidence of the biblical flood is still not clear. Okay, so now we are on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In West Jordan in 1947, near the ruins of Qumran, also known as Kerbet, days and had stringent rules governing the day. It is thought that the Essenes were not one unified group, but consisted of... if you can hear a scratching noise, my cat's trying to get into the door. I do apologise. But consisted of numerous distinct groups, each with its own rules and regulation of faith. Okay, the plundered library. More than half a year passed between the time a Bedouin youth discovered the clay pots inside a cave near Qumran and the first thorough analysis of the scrolls they contained. During this time interval, the young man first tried to sell the parchment rolls. Later, war between Egypt and Israel, 1947 to 1949, made textual analysis by experts at Jerusalem University even more difficult. In January 1948, after one of the manuscripts had been identified as a version of the book of the prophet Isaiah, an expedition to search the caves was quickly dispatched. When the caves were finally located, it was quite clear that their contents had been thoroughly plundered. The fragments that remained suggested that between 200 and 250 scrolls had originally been stored here. In 10 neighbouring caves, still more manuscripts and fragments were found. Based on the biblical content of the scrolls and the cave's proximity to the ruins of Qumran, which had been described by the Roman scholar Plinius, 24 to 69 AD, as the location of an Essene religious settlement, a connection was made between these scrolls and the Essene community or Essen community. Confusing discoveries. Today we know that approximately 500 different scribes produced the 800 or so texts or fragments of texts that were ultimately recovered, writing in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, or Nabatean. The scrolls were dated between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. This result encouraged a closer look at the Qumran ruins, triggering a discussion that continues to this day. The unusually high number of scrolls alone, as well as the number of scribes involved, together with the age of some of the texts, raised questions concerning the extent of the Essen complex or Essene complex. Roman coins found during This was the emperor, who was the first to pray to the Christ child, but also the man who would elevate secular rulers above the rank of the princes of the church. The Star of Bethlehem. Just as Matthew was the only gospel writer to mention the wise men, the Star of Bethlehem is also missing from the other gospels. Here again, one can assume that this is an example of the use of a symbol, the conscious placing of a sign on high. Investigations have nevertheless attempted to trace the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem back to an astronomical phenomenon. One of the oldest theories, reported as early as the 3rd century AD, says that the star might have been a comet. This sounds reasonable, especially since there were comets visible from the Earth in the time prior to Christ's birth. It has since been proven, however, that none of these comets were in any way exceptionally visible. Other theories propose that a supernova, an exploding star, would have been responsible for the star's sudden appearance above Bethlehem. Since no evidence of this has been found, this claim is probably untenable. The third possibility would be a conjunction of two stars. Now, it says, see the box on the right. Let's read that. The meeting of two stars. A conjunction is said to take place when, as viewed from the Earth, two stars appear to move tightly together or line up, one behind the other. When this happens, their surfaces reflecting the light of the sun seem larger than normal, making an alignment like this brighter and more visible than any one star on its own would appear. This theory is supported by the frequent occurrence of conjunctions in the time period shortly before Christ was born. On the other hand, similar to the situation with the comet theory, it is not clear why this one conjunction would be viewed as being in any way unusual to the people experiencing it. In addition, it has been calculated that the conjunction over Bethlehem was not perfect, meaning it would have required little effort to distinguish the individual stars from each other. This discrepancy would have destroyed any impression that the conjunction his possession of the cloth alone was proof that he was the true pope. After the Council of Constance, actually a series of councils held between 1414 and 1418, brought about the reunification of the Catholic Church, the shroud lost its political meaning. The shroud was then returned to the Collegiate Church of Leary for storage, but was later exhibited in other European cities. It finally fell into the possession of Ludwig, Duke of Savoy, who stored it in the ducal castle chapel in Chambry. It was there in 1532 that the shroud was damaged by fire. The silver of the box in which the relic was stored melted, leaving holes and jar marks in the cloth. In 1578, Ludwig's heir, Duke Emmanuel Philibert, brought the shroud to Turin, where it has remained ever since. Though it has since changed hands, it was bequeathed to the Holy See in 1983 and is currently not accessible to the public. Science and belief. For many centuries, the authenticity of the shroud had only been discussed from a theological point of view. In 1898, the linen finally became the focus of scientific inquiry. The trigger was a man named Secondo Pia. At that time, the mayor of Asti, Italy, and an amateur photographer who took many pictures of the shroud during a multi-day exhibition. When he developed the photographs, he noticed that the man's body was much clearer in the negatives than in the prints. Many investigations through the following years were made with these negatives close at hand. Different methods were used to gather more information about the linen cloth and its history. A Swiss botanist investigated the grains of pollen trapped in the material, concluding that the grains could only have come from the area around Jerusalem. Scientific investigations. Forensic medical investigations of the shroud, which began in the 1930s, concluded that the body on the linen represented a man who had died due to crucifixion, who had suffered numerous wounds from a whip-like instrument of torture before his death. He had worn a crown of thorns, and his death had been confirmed by a lance thrust into his side. These results were based on the traces of blood found on the cloth. Great media interest was awakened when the first radiocarbon dating of the shroud took place in laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. The results dated the production of the cloth to between 1260 and 1390 AD. This scientific proof seemed to confirm the cloth as a forgery. However, those supporting the authenticity of the shroud criticised the research protocol soon afterward, some going so far as to accuse the researchers of fraud, perhaps achieved by switching samples. The most recent investigations used lignin, vanillin, decomposition as a dating method. These results showed that the cloth was between 1300 and 3000 years old. While this makes it possible that the radiocarbon dates are in error, no further concrete proposals, including one suggestion that the image could be the product of a chemical reaction caused by the evaporation of aloe, which can be used to anoint a body before burial, have also proved unfounded. While experiments showed that evaporation did leave an image behind, the contrast wasn't nearly as strong as that of the image on the shroud. In addition to the question of how the linen came to be imprinted with this intriguing image, speculation continues as to how the shroud could have remained hidden for over 1300 years, as well as how it passed from Palestine to France at all. The question as to whether the man whose shroud has caused a stir for over 650 years really is Jesus Christ is also unanswered. Our Lady of Guadalupe. It is said that in December 1531, the Mother of God appeared to the peasant Juan Diego in the town of Guadalupe, Mexico, entrusting him with the task of having a church built on that spot. When the Archbishop refused to fulfill this request, an image of the Virgin appeared on Diego's apron. This relic is still on display at the place where Mary first appeared to him. The apparition. According to legends, Juan Diego was on his way to Mass in Tlatelolco, where Mexico City is now, when he heard a hymn come down from heaven. The voice of the Virgin Mary spoke to him from a cloud, sending him to the Bishop of Mexico to request that a church be built at the place of their meeting. When Juan Diego was finally allowed to meet with the bishop, the prelate did not believe him and sent Diego back home. The next day, Juan Diego went to the same place and again heard the voice of Our Lady asking him to appear before the bishop in her name so that a church could be built on that spot. Again the bishop sent the peasant home. When Juan Diego arrived back at the place where he had heard the voice twice before, he told the lady that the bishop would not believe him without a sign. When Diego returned to the house, he found his uncle mortally ill. The village doctor was not able to help him, so the uncle told the nephew to go fetch a priest to administer last rites. On his way to the city, he met a woman whose voice he recognised as that of the Virgin. She told him that his uncle was already healed and sent him to pick faintest sounds could be discerned. These brushstrokes, incidentally, were more likely to have suffered the ravages of time than the original image underneath. Upon investigation, the eye of the Virgin was shown to include the reflected images of several persons within it. This alone gave researchers new mysteries to investigate, because these figures were at a scale that was almost microscopic. In addition, the rules of optical distortion have been observed, although these were not developed in painting until much later. The mystery of Our Lady of Guadalupe still has not been explained, and there are no convincing theories of how the image was produced. The imprinted cloth of Juan Diego is visited by millions of pilgrims every year, who, now as then,